The smallest gun on the firing line was about to teach the biggest lesson. The laughter started before Walter Hayes even closed the door of his faded blue pickup truck. It rolled across the outdoor shooting range like a summer breeze, bouncing between covered benches, steel target racks, and rows of expensive rifle cases lined up beneath the bright July sun. Most of the shooters barely looked at the old man himself. Their eyes went straight to the small hard case tucked under his arm. Walter was 78 years old, his white hair trimmed short beneath a weathered baseball cap, his faded flannel shirt neatly pressed despite years of use. He walked with an easy, steady pace that belonged to someone who had learned long ago that there was never any reason to hurry. The gravel crunched softly beneath his boots while conversations around him slowed just enough for curious glances to become open stares. A young man wearing expensive hearing protection nudged his friend and pointed toward Walter's case with an amused grin. Another shook his head before quietly laughing. Someone muttered that the old-timer must have wandered into the wrong competition. Walter heard every word, yet his expression never changed. At the registration counter stood Ethan Brooks, 27 years old, the range instructor responsible for organizing the day's precision challenge. He carried himself with the confidence of someone respected by regular members and trusted by newcomers. His clean range polo, embroidered logo, and polished manner reflected years of professional training. When Walter reached the counter, Ethan offered a polite smile that slowly faded the moment the old man opened his pistol case. Resting inside was a remarkably simple .22 caliber target pistol. The finish had worn thin around the grip, the edges softened by decades of careful handling. It looked completely out of place beside the custom-built competition firearms resting on nearby tables. Ethan blinked twice before asking, "Sir, are you planning to use that today?" Walter nodded once. "It has always been enough." Several nearby shooters overheard the exchange. More laughter spread across the firing line. One competitor holding a high-end target pistol quietly whispered that the museum probably wanted its exhibit back. Another joked that maybe the targets would feel sorry for the old man. Ethan remained professional, but even he struggled to hide his doubt. He glanced toward the event schedule clipped to his clipboard before looking back at Walter. "Today's precision course is our most difficult qualification. Targets begin at 25 yards and continue through multiple stages. Most first-time participants choose the beginner lane." Walter gently closed his pistol case and rested one weathered hand across the handle. "I would like the full course." Ethan hesitated for a moment, almost expecting the old veteran to smile and admit he was joking. Instead, Walter simply waited. There was nothing defensive in his posture, nothing challenging in his voice. Only quiet certainty. Ethan finally handed over the registration form. "It is your choice, sir." Walter thanked him with a small nod, signed his name in careful handwriting, and accepted his lane assignment. As he stepped away, another burst of laughter drifted across the benches. One young shooter confidently declared that the little pistol would never keep tight groups beyond the first distance. Walter neither answered nor looked back. He carried the worn case toward his assigned lane exactly as he had approached everything else that morning, calm, measured, and completely untouched by the opinions surrounding him. High above the range, the American flag moved gently against the blue summer sky while a warm breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut grass and spent powder through the open field. Somewhere beyond the rows of targets, a hawk circled silently overhead. Walter paused beside the wooden shooting bench, placed the old pistol case down with extraordinary care, and rested both hands lightly against the weathered lid for just a second. It was such a small movement that almost nobody noticed. But for reasons none of them could explain, the laughter around the range slowly began to fade. Walter unlocked the worn case with slow, familiar movements that looked almost ceremonial. Inside, the little .22 caliber pistol rested exactly where it had for years, every surface spotless despite its age. He picked it up with steady hands, checked the chamber, inspected the sights, and placed it gently on the shooting bench. There was no unnecessary motion, no attempt to impress anyone watching. Every action flowed into the next with the quiet confidence of someone repeating a routine practice thousands of times. Around him, conversations continued, Several competitors glanced toward Lane 7 before returning to their expensive equipment. One man adjusted a large competition scope, while another proudly described the custom trigger installed on his newest pistol. Every few seconds another curious look drifted toward Walter, followed by a smile or a shake of the head. Ethan Brooks walked down the line performing final safety inspections before the first relay. When he reached Walter's station, he noticed something unusual. The old veteran had not rushed through any part of his preparation. His hearing protection rested neatly beside the pistol. His ammunition box was carefully organized. Even the empty brass tray had been positioned with deliberate precision. Nothing appeared random. Ethan cleared his throat. "Everything looks in order, Mr. Hayes. Are you certain you do not want to move to the introductory course? There is absolutely no shame in starting there." Walter looked up with calm blue eyes that carried neither pride nor offense. "Thank you for asking. I am exactly where I need to be." Ethan nodded politely, although uncertainty lingered across his face. As he continued down the firing line, one of the younger shooters quietly laughed. "He is stubborn, I will give him that." Another answered, "He will learn after the first stage." Walter heard them, just as he had heard every comment since arriving, but none of it seemed to occupy his thoughts. Instead, he sat down on the wooden bench and simply watched the targets stretching across the open field. White circles shimmered beneath the summer heat nearly 25 yards away, while farther stages disappeared into the bright afternoon haze. A light breeze brushed across the range, causing the small American flags mounted beside each firing lane to flutter gently. Walter noticed the movement immediately. He watched the flags for several seconds without touching his pistol. Then he lifted his gaze toward the treetops beyond the backstop, studying the leaves as they shifted almost imperceptibly. It was such a quiet observation that nobody nearby realized he was already gathering information long before the first shot would ever be fired. At the opposite end of the range, an older maintenance employee named Samuel Carter slowly rolled a utility cart between the benches collecting empty boxes left from the morning session. He happened to glance toward Lane 7 just as Walter carefully adjusted the position of his feet without looking down. Samuel paused for a brief moment. There was something strangely familiar about the old man's posture. It was balanced without appearing rigid, relaxed without becoming careless. Samuel frowned thoughtfully before continuing his work, unable to explain why the image lingered in his memory. A loudspeaker crackled overhead announcing that competitors should prepare for the opening stage. Shooters began loading magazines, adjusting sights, and making final equipment checks. The atmosphere shifted from casual conversation to focused anticipation. Ethan returned to the center of the firing line, clipboard in hand, reviewing names one final time before giving the signal. As his eyes briefly met Walter's again, he noticed the veteran had closed them for only a single quiet breath. When Walter opened them again, the calm expression remained exactly the same, but somehow the entire firing line felt different, as though the noise surrounding him had quietly disappeared long before anyone realized the competition had truly begun. The range officer raised one arm and the steady murmur across the firing line slowly disappeared. Competitors settled behind their benches, each surrounded by polished equipment, precision optics, and expensive accessories that reflected the afternoon sun. Walter Hayes remained almost perfectly still. His little .22 caliber pistol rested on the bench in front of him, while his hands stayed folded quietly for another brief moment. He was never the first person to rush. He had learned many years earlier that patience often arrived before accuracy. Ethan Brooks scanned the line one final time, confirming hearing protection, chamber flags, and lane readiness before giving the command to prepare. Magazines clicked into place across the range. Metal slides moved forward in practiced rhythm. Walter performed the same sequence without haste. Every movement looked economical, almost effortless, as though nothing had been added that did not absolutely need to exist. Nearby competitors continued exchanging confident smiles. One younger shooter whispered that the old man was taking so long because he was nervous. Another suggested he probably had not fired that pistol in years. Neither realized Walter was paying attention to something entirely different. His eyes drifted once more toward the small American flags mounted beside each lane. The breeze had changed slightly since the registration period. It now crossed the open field at a shallow angle instead of moving directly from behind the firing line. Walter noticed the subtle shift without measuring instruments or electronic displays. He simply watched the fabric rise and settle, then looked toward the grass near the target stands where tiny patches of dust lifted for only a second before disappearing again. Samuel Carter, the older maintenance employee, slowed his utility cart once more. This time he remained standing beside the fence instead of continuing his work. He had spent decades maintaining the facility and had watched thousands of competitors prepare for qualification courses. Most adjusted optics repeatedly. Others checked wind charts or discussed ammunition performance until the last possible second. Walter did none of those things. Instead, he quietly observed the range itself, almost as though he were listening to something invisible. Samuel narrowed his eyes. The image stirred an old memory that refused to become clear. Ethan stepped toward lane 7 carrying his clipboard. He noticed Walter gently reposition one sandbag beneath his wrist by less than an inch before placing both feet flat against the concrete pad. There was nothing dramatic about it, yet the movement appeared incredibly deliberate. Ethan found himself watching longer than he intended. He could not explain why the old veteran seemed completely unaffected by the pressure surrounding him. Most first-time participants displayed small signs of tension before difficult qualification courses. They adjusted clothing, shifted weight, or spoke nervously. Walter simply breathed at an even pace while looking downrange with quiet concentration. The loudspeaker announced that the first stage would begin in 30 seconds. The final conversations faded into silence. Heat shimmered above the distant targets, making the white circles appear to float gently against the dark backstop. Walter blinked once, then lowered his head just enough to align naturally behind the sights. There was no dramatic pose, no exaggerated focus, only relaxed precision built through countless ordinary days of disciplined practice. Samuel suddenly stopped breathing for a brief second as another memory surfaced. He remembered seeing that exact posture many years earlier in an army demonstration held at a military base not far from the range. The instructor had explained that true experts never fought the firearm. They allowed consistent technique to do the work while every unnecessary movement disappeared. Samuel quietly looked toward Walter's registration card resting on the nearby table. The name felt strangely familiar, but the memory remained just beyond reach. Ethan raised the electronic timer into the air and gave the final instruction for the opening stage. Every competitor fixed their attention on the first target. Walter rested his finger carefully outside the trigger guard, his expression unchanged, while the last trace of laughter that had filled the range earlier that afternoon had been replaced by something no one expected to feel so soon: curiosity. The electronic timer released its sharp signal into the warm afternoon air, and every shooter on the firing line settled into the opening stage. The familiar rhythm of careful breathing, steady hands, and measured concentration spread across the range. Walter Hayes lifted his little .22 caliber pistol with the same quiet confidence he had carried since stepping out of his pickup truck. There was nothing dramatic about the motion. His shoulders remained relaxed, his elbows naturally balanced, and his breathing never changed. Ethan Brooks watched from several lanes away while keeping one eye on the competitors and the other on the digital scoring monitors positioned beside the qualification course. He expected the older man to struggle during the opening sequence. After all, the course had challenged experienced shooters using equipment specifically designed for modern competition. Walter's pistol looked as though it belonged to another generation entirely. The first series began. Several competitors fired quickly, eager to establish an early lead. Brass landed neatly across the concrete pads while electronic sensors prepared to register each result. Walter did not rush to match anyone else's pace. He allowed a quiet breath to settle before pressing the trigger with such smooth control that the movement seemed almost invisible. The report from the little pistol sounded modest beside the larger firearms surrounding it, yet every nearby head instinctively turned toward the electronic display a moment later. A small light flashed. Then the digital monitor updated. Perfect center. Nobody spoke. One young competitor frowned and leaned closer to the screen before quietly shaking his head. Another shrugged and smiled. Lucky first shot, he whispered under his breath. Ethan glanced toward the display, acknowledged the score, and returned his attention to supervising the firing line. Excellent shots occasionally happened by chance. One perfect hit proved nothing. Walter calmly lowered the pistol, breathed once more, and prepared for the second target. Again his eyes briefly settled on the distant flag near the far berm. Again he waited for a nearly invisible pause in the breeze before gently pressing the trigger. Another modest report echoed across the range. Another light appeared. Another perfect center. The conversations that normally followed each relay never arrived. Instead, several shooters quietly looked away from their own targets and toward Lane 7. Walter remained completely unaware of the attention gathering around him. His expression never celebrated success because, to him, there was nothing unusual happening. He simply repeated the same disciplined process with patient consistency. Samuel Carter slowly removed his cap and rubbed the back of his neck while studying Walter's posture more carefully than ever before. The image from long ago continued returning in fragments. A military demonstration. An instructor whose movements looked effortless. A lesson about letting discipline replace force. Samuel could almost hear the words again, but the name remained hidden somewhere deep inside his memory. Ethan noticed the growing distraction spreading among the competitors. Several shooters had begun watching Walter instead of concentrating on their own performance. Wanting to maintain order, he reminded everyone to stay focused on their assigned lanes. Even while speaking, he found himself glancing back toward Walter's monitor. The third shot arrived with the same unhurried rhythm. Another perfect center appeared on the screen almost instantly. This time nobody laughed. The young man who had joked about the museum exhibits slowly lowered his expensive pistol and stared toward Lane 7 without saying a word. The confidence that had filled the firing line less than an hour earlier was quietly giving way to genuine uncertainty. Walter simply rested the little pistol on the bench between strings, folded his hands for a brief moment, and looked peacefully downrange as though he were enjoying an ordinary afternoon rather than becoming the center of everyone's attention. Ethan looked once more at the flawless pattern appearing beside Walter's name on the electronic scoreboard. For the first time that day, doubt no longer centered on the old veteran. It centered on every assumption the range had made when he first walked through the gate. The qualification moved into its next stage, and the distance increased while the targets appeared slightly smaller beneath the shimmering summer heat. Most competitors adjusted their sights, compared notes with friends during the brief pause, or carefully examined their previous scores. Walter Hayes did none of those things. He quietly wiped the wooden grip of his little .22 caliber pistol with a clean cloth, closed the ammunition box, and waited for the next command with the same relaxed patience that had marked every moment since arriving at the range. Ethan Brooks stood beside the electronic scoreboard reviewing the opening results. Walter's name remained alone at the top, every recorded hit resting exactly where precision shooters hoped they would land but rarely did with complete consistency. Ethan checked the system twice to be certain nothing had malfunctioned. Everything worked perfectly. He quietly asked another range officer to verify the readings, and the second official simply nodded before saying, "The scores are accurate." A ripple of quiet conversation spread across the firing line. The laughter that had welcomed Walter earlier had disappeared completely, replaced by curious whispers and uncertain glances. One competitor folded his arms and stared toward Lane 7 as though searching for some hidden explanation. Another looked down at Walter's modest pistol before looking back at the scoreboard, unable to make sense of what he was seeing. Samuel Carter continued watching from near the maintenance shed. Suddenly the missing memory arrived with remarkable clarity. More than 30 years earlier he had volunteered during an Army marksmanship exhibition hosted at a nearby military installation. Hundreds of visitors had gathered to watch elite instructors demonstrate the value of discipline over expensive equipment. Samuel remembered one quiet ranger whose presentation had surprised everyone. Instead of choosing the newest firearm available, The instructor had stepped onto the firing line carrying an ordinary .22 caliber pistol. Before beginning, the ranger had smiled gently and said, "Accuracy begins long before the trigger moves." Samuel could still hear those exact words echoing inside his memory. His eyes immediately returned to Walter. The calm posture. The patient breathing. The complete absence of unnecessary motion. Samuel slowly whispered to himself, "It cannot be." The loudspeaker announced the beginning of the next string. Ethan raised the timer once again, but this time he found himself watching Walter as closely as anyone else. The signal sounded. Competitors resumed firing. Walter repeated the same deliberate rhythm that had already transformed the atmosphere across the range. He waited for the breeze to soften, allowed a quiet breath to settle, and pressed the trigger with almost invisible control. The electronic monitor updated. Perfect center. Another careful breath followed. Another measured shot. Perfect center again. The sequence continued until every target in the stage displayed the same remarkable pattern. Nobody celebrated. Nobody applauded. The silence carried far more weight than applause ever could. Even the competitors who had arrived expecting an easy victory now stood motionless beside their benches. Ethan slowly lowered his clipboard without realizing he was doing it. He had spent years teaching shooters that consistent fundamentals always mattered more than expensive equipment, yet standing only a few yards away was someone demonstrating that lesson at a level he had never personally witnessed. Samuel finally stepped away from the fence and walked toward the registration table. His hands searched through the participant forms until he found Walter's neatly written signature. He stared at the name for several long seconds before a faint smile crossed his weathered face. The memory was no longer uncertain. He knew exactly where he had seen that quiet ranger before, and he realized that almost everyone standing on the range was about to discover they had spent the afternoon laughing at a man whose reputation had once spoken for itself long before anyone cared what kind of pistol he carried. The final stage of the qualification course was known throughout the range as the one that separated good shooters from disciplined marksmen. Smaller targets had been placed at varying distances across the field, forcing competitors to rely on consistency rather than speed. Several participants quietly adjusted their sights once again, while others exchanged nervous smiles that had not been there earlier in the afternoon. Walter Hayes remained exactly as he had been since the beginning. He sat comfortably behind the wooden bench, the little .22 caliber pistol resting beside a neatly folded cloth, his weathered hands relaxed as though he had all the time in the world. Ethan Brooks stepped to the center of the firing line and explained the final sequence. Even while speaking, he found himself glancing toward Walter. The elderly veteran no longer looked like an unexpected participant. Somehow, without saying a single word, he had become the quiet standard against which everyone else was measuring themselves. Samuel Carter approached Ethan after the instructions were finished and spoke softly enough that only the young instructor could hear him. "Do you know who that gentleman is?" Ethan shook his head. Samuel looked toward Lane 7 before answering. "About 30 years ago I volunteered during an Army marksmanship demonstration. There was a Ranger instructor who amazed everyone with an old .22 pistol. Before he fired a single round, he said accuracy was built by discipline, not equipment. I never forgot those words. I believe that man is Walter Hayes." Ethan looked back toward the registration card with Walter's name printed across the top, then toward the calm figure waiting quietly behind the bench. The realization settled over him slowly. The old veteran had never tried to impress anyone. He had never mentioned military experience, never corrected the jokes, and never defended the pistol that so many people had dismissed. He had simply allowed his actions to speak. The timer sounded for the final course. Every competitor focused on the distant targets. Walter lifted the little pistol with the same steady rhythm that had now become unmistakable. His breathing remained even. His shoulders stayed relaxed. He watched the distant flags for a brief moment, waited for the breeze to soften, and gently pressed the trigger. The electronic monitor immediately displayed another perfect center. The pattern continued through every remaining target. Each careful shot appeared almost identical to the one before it, not because of luck but because every movement had been repeated with extraordinary discipline. When the final score appeared across the electronic board, the range fell completely silent. Walter had completed the most difficult qualification course without a single point lost. Several experienced competitors slowly removed their hearing protection, not because the event had ended, but because they wanted to look at the elderly veteran with complete attention. Ethan walked toward lane 7 carrying the printed score sheet in both hands. He stopped in front of Walter for a long moment before speaking. "Mr. Hayes, I owe you an apology. I looked at your equipment instead of your experience. I believed modern gear would decide today's outcome. I was wrong." Walter accepted the score sheet with a warm smile that carried neither pride nor resentment. "We all learn from somebody," he replied quietly. "Sometimes the lesson arrives before we expect it." Ethan nodded respectfully. "Would you tell us how you stayed so consistent?" Walter looked down at the little pistol before answering. "This old tool never made the decisions. The important work happened years before today. Every careful practice session, every patient correction, every ordinary day when nobody was watching. Confidence is earned one quiet repetition at a time." No one laughed now. Instead, the competitors stood together beneath the warm July sky, watching the elderly ranger close his worn pistol case with the same gentle care he had shown from the beginning. The little .22 had not changed during the afternoon. What had changed was every assumption surrounding it, because the greatest demonstration on the range had never been about a firearm at all. It had been about humility, discipline, and the quiet strength of a lifetime spent mastering simple things. The afternoon sun had begun its slow descent, casting longer shadows across the firing line, yet almost no one seemed interested in packing their equipment anymore. Competitors who normally compared scores or discussed the latest accessories now gathered quietly near lane 7, not to admire a firearm but to understand the man who had carried it. Walter Hayes secured the small brass latch on his worn pistol case with the same careful attention he had given every other step throughout the day. He did not linger beside the scoreboard waiting for congratulations. He simply wiped the bench clean, placed the empty ammunition box inside the case, and prepared to leave as though he had finished another ordinary practice session. Ethan Brooks stepped forward once again, this time without the confidence that had marked his first conversation with the elderly veteran. Instead, there was genuine respect in his voice. "Mr. Hayes, would you mind staying for just a few more minutes? Several people would like to meet you." Walter smiled gently. "If they came to learn, I still have time." Those simple words spread through the small crowd more quickly than any announcement over the loudspeaker. Within moments, shooters of every age quietly formed a loose circle around the wooden bench. Some carried competition pistols worth several $1,000s. Others held basic training firearms. For the first time all afternoon, nobody seemed interested in comparing equipment. A young father standing near the back encouraged his teenage daughter to step closer. She had entered her first local match that morning and had struggled with confidence after missing several difficult targets. Walter noticed her hesitation immediately. "Would you like to hold it?" he asked, offering the little .22 pistol only after confirming it was completely safe and unloaded. The teenager accepted it carefully, looking surprised by its balance. "It feels lighter than I expected," she admitted. Walter nodded. "That is because people often carry more doubt than they carry weight." Several adults exchanged thoughtful smiles after hearing the quiet observation. Ethan listened without interrupting. He realized the veteran was teaching exactly as he had competed, calmly, without trying to impress anyone. Samuel Carter finally stepped beside Walter with a warm expression. "I knew I recognized you," he said. "You spoke at Fort Harrison more than 30 years ago. I was helping set up targets that day." Walter studied Samuel's face for a moment before his eyes brightened with recognition. "You were the young volunteer who stayed after everyone left to sweep the range." Samuel laughed softly. "I did not think you would remember," Walter answered. "People who quietly do their job are worth remembering." The words left Samuel speechless. Ethan looked between the two men, realizing that Walter's remarkable memory extended beyond scores and marksmanship. He remembered people. One of the experienced competitors stepped forward and asked the question everyone had been wondering. If you could only give one piece of advice to every shooter here, what would it be? Walter rested one hand on the old pistol case before answering. Do not chase perfect shots. Chase perfect habits. The shots will eventually follow. Silence settled over the gathering once more, not because no one had anything to say, but because everyone understood the truth behind those words. The lesson reached far beyond the firing line. It applied to work, family, friendships, and every quiet responsibility that required patience long before success became visible. Ethan glanced once more at the flawless score displayed beside Walter's name. Earlier that afternoon he had believed the qualification course would reveal the limits of an aging veteran carrying outdated equipment. Instead, it had revealed the limits of assumptions built on appearances alone. As Walter lifted the worn pistol case and began walking toward his faded blue pickup truck, the competitors instinctively stepped aside, creating a clear path without anyone asking them to do so. No applause echoed across the range. None was needed. The deepest respect often arrived without noise, carried instead in quiet gestures that lasted far longer than words. Walter Hayes reached the driver's side of his faded blue pickup truck before hearing footsteps approaching across the gravel. He turned and saw Ethan Brooks walking toward him with the printed qualification certificate held carefully in both hands. The younger instructor no longer carried himself with the certainty of someone who believed he already knew every answer. Instead, he looked like a student hoping to remember an important lesson for the rest of his life. Mr. Hayes, Ethan said, stopping a respectful distance away, there is one more thing I would like to ask before you leave. Walter smiled warmly and waited. Would you allow us to hang your score inside the clubhouse? We keep records of memorable performances, and I believe today's belongs there. Walter looked toward the small building overlooking the range where decades of photographs, championship plaques, and faded newspaper clippings lined the walls. He thought quietly for a moment before answering. The score can stay if it helps someone believe that patience still matters. Ethan nodded with genuine appreciation. I think it will do exactly that. Several competitors who had followed at a respectful distance gathered nearby, listening without interrupting. The teenage girl who had held Walter's little pistol earlier stepped forward carrying a notebook. Sir, she asked shyly, would you sign this for me? Walter accepted the notebook, but before writing his name he asked, what is your first name? Claire, she answered. Walter wrote slowly beneath his signature, then handed the notebook back. Claire looked down and read the sentence aloud in a quiet voice. Practice until confidence becomes quieter than fear. She smiled, closed the notebook carefully, and held it against her chest as though it had become something far more valuable than an autograph. Samuel Carter joined the small group with an old framed photograph he had found inside the clubhouse storage room. The edges had faded with time, but the image remained clear enough to recognize a much younger Walter standing beside a line of Army Rangers during the marksmanship demonstration from decades earlier. Samuel held it out with a grin. I thought you might like to see this again. Walter studied the photograph for several seconds before gently laughing. We all had darker hair back then. The group laughed softly with him. There was no boasting, no long speech about accomplishments, only a quiet appreciation for memories shared across generations. Ethan looked closely at the photograph and then back at the man standing before him. You never mentioned any of this today, he said. Walter carefully returned the photograph to Samuel. People should never have to introduce themselves with yesterday's achievements. If experience still has value, it will show itself when the time is right. Those words settled over the gathering with the same calm weight that had filled the firing line throughout the afternoon. No one rushed to respond because everyone understood the truth behind them. The expensive pistols, customized grips, precision optics, and polished trophies suddenly seemed much smaller beside a lifetime of quiet discipline. Ethan extended his hand once more, and this time Walter accepted it without hesitation. The handshake lasted only a moment, yet it carried far more meaning than their first conversation at the registration counter. Around them, competitors began loading equipment into their vehicles, but the mood across the range had changed completely. Conversations centered on breathing, consistency, humility, and practice instead of equipment prices or brand names. As Walter finally opened the truck door, Claire looked toward Ethan and smiled. "I think everybody came here expecting to learn about shooting." Ethan watched the elderly ranger settle the worn pistol case gently onto the passenger seat before replying. "Instead, we learned about character." Beneath the warm July sky, the American flag continued moving quietly in the evening breeze, and for everyone who had witnessed the day unfold, the range no longer felt like the same place they had entered only a few hours earlier. Walter Hayes started the engine of his faded blue pickup truck, but before shifting into gear he paused for a moment and looked through the windshield toward the quiet range one final time. The evening sun painted long golden shadows across the firing lanes where only a few hours earlier laughter had echoed from one bench to another. Now the same place carried an entirely different feeling. Competitors were loading equipment into their vehicles with slower movements, and conversations no longer centered on expensive firearms or the newest accessories. Instead, people discussed breathing, patience, consistency, and discipline. Ethan Brooks stood near the clubhouse entrance holding Walter's framed qualification certificate before carefully carrying it inside. He chose a place on the wall beside photographs of past champions and longtime instructors, not because Walter had asked for recognition, but because the lesson behind the score deserved to remain where future visitors could see it. Beneath the certificate, Ethan placed a small engraved plaque with a single sentence that everyone who had witnessed the day would immediately understand. It read, "Skill is earned long before it is seen." Samuel Carter watched from the doorway with a quiet smile. He knew that years from now people would probably ask about the elderly ranger whose simple pistol had become part of the range's history. Samuel also knew that the most important part of the story would never be the score itself. It would be the reminder that appearances often reveal the least about a person's true ability. Across the parking lot, Claire carefully opened her notebook again before climbing into her father's truck. She reread the words Walter had written only minutes earlier. "Practice until confidence becomes quieter than fear." Her father noticed the thoughtful expression on her face and asked if she had enjoyed her first competition despite the difficult start. Claire smiled and nodded. "I think today was worth more than a trophy." Her father smiled without replying because he understood exactly what she meant. Ethan stepped outside once more just as Walter slowly pulled the pickup toward the exit. The younger instructor raised one hand in a respectful wave. Walter answered with a gentle nod before continuing toward the country road stretching beyond the range. There was no dramatic farewell, no celebration, and no crowd surrounding the truck. It felt completely natural, as though the old veteran preferred to leave the same quiet way he had arrived. The American flag near the entrance continued moving softly in the evening breeze while the last light of the July sun reflected across the windshield for only a brief moment before the pickup disappeared beyond the trees. Several competitors remained standing in silence until the truck was no longer visible. None of them seemed eager to break the moment. Eventually Ethan looked across the range and spoke quietly to the remaining shooters. "Every new member who comes here will hear today's story. Not because someone set a perfect score, but because all of us learn how easily pride can mistake experience for weakness." Heads nodded all around him. No one disagreed. The little .22 caliber pistol would eventually become another memory. The score would one day be surpassed, and the afternoon itself would slowly fade into history. Yet the lesson carried home by everyone who stood on that firing line would remain far longer than any record ever could. Real mastery did not announce itself with noise. It arrived with humility, revealed itself through quiet discipline, and departed without asking for applause. Some people spend a lifetime trying to prove who they are. Others simply live in such a way that the truth speaks for them when the moment finally arrives.